Having just worked with a modern reprint of a vintage sewing pattern, I wanted to compare the experience to an original vintage sewing pattern. I chose this 1950s slip pattern as I felt it would be a useful addition to my vintage wardrobe. This pattern was in excellent condition, and to keep it that way, I traced the original pattern onto tracing paper. Unlike modern patterns, vintage patterns have no printed lines or markings. They rely on punched holes and perforations. They also only come in one size. This pattern happened to match my measurements well, so I decided not to make any adjustments. I had to check the printed instructions to see what all those funny little circles meant. I had also mistakenly purchased a narrower width of tracing paper, which meant that the wider skirt pieces I had to do some creative paper piecing. I also had to consult the pattern's lay plan for information on how many of each piece I needed, and began cutting. For this project, I used a simple white cotton broadcloth that I had in my stash. I was kind of treating this project as a wearable mock-up, as I hope to make this pattern again with a more expensive silk in the future. But rather than just make a toile for a silk slip, I took the opportunity to make an actual garment and practice a few techniques. I had to also do a little bit of fabric piecing, as I didn't have enough fabric left to cut the upper band on the fold. I simply added some seam allowance to the fold edge and cut two pieces with a centre back seam instead. As I was using white fabric, I didn't want to use a coloured chalk to mark up the pattern pieces, as I find that coloured chalk can be quite stubborn to remove. Instead, I used tailor's tacks to transfer all the information from the pattern pieces. I then returned to my written instructions and began the construction processes. First, I joined the upper fronts to the upper backs at the side seam, matching my tailor's tacks, and then pressing the seams open. I then stitched up the newly added centre back seam of the upper band and again pressed that open. Then, matching the tailor's tacks, I began to shape the upper band so that it would bend around the angles of the neckline. The instructions and illustrations for this part weren't particularly clear, and I mostly worked on instinct and hoped for the best. Thankfully, I ended up with a band with several mitered corners that followed the shape of the neckline. I then stitched in the darts, remembering not to reverse at the point and to leave a long tail of thread instead. I then tied off the threads and clipped them close to the knot. I then joined the two ends of the band together at what would be the centre front, below the first set of darts. This was tricky to do accurately, and I ended up stopping a little short of the darts and hand sewing the rest for greater accuracy. When I flip the band right side out, you can just see the little gap at the top. I pressed all the darts in place so that I got some crisp corners and trimmed down some of the bulk to help them lie flatter. I also pressed open the centre front seam. I then pressed the rest of the band in half with wrong sides together. Here I am, just closing up that little gap from before. I then basted the two raw edges of the band together with a long running stitch. Part of the reason I had chosen to make this pattern was because I wanted to practice using insertion lace. I pinned the insertion lace in place 1.5 centimeters up from the raw edge of the lower band. As I approached the corners, I folded the lace to create a mitered corner and pinned it in place, continuing along the new angle of the lower edge of the band. This was kind of fiddly to get right, and I definitely went back and adjusted it several more times than I am showing here in the video. I carried on pinning around the rest of the lower band and then tacked the lace in place. For this, I used long diagonal basting stitches rather than running stitches for greater stability. After all that fiddly pinning, I did not want this lace sliding around on me. I tacked the pleats at the corners in place as I got to them. When finished, it looked like this. I actually found this really satisfying, was kind of reluctant to then machine the whole thing in place, but I did, stitching very close to the edge of the lace from the right side and pivoting at the corners. Once machined in place, I removed all that beautiful tacking. The pleats and the lace were then stitched in place by hand with the slip stitch. The seam allowance of the upper band was then trimmed right back as close as possible to the stitching of the lace. The bottom of the lace is then joined to the top of the bodice in the same way, only the top and front edge of the bodice was a completely different shape to the bottom of the band. The instructions said only to ease it in, so again I winged it and trusted to the sewing gods. I started at the back and then pinned the front section on top of the pattern pieces I had until they were approximately the shape of the paper pattern. I then tacked this in place, easing as I went, and then machined the whole thing as close to the edge as possible. In fact, my lace had a handy little groove in the design which made this a lot easier and looked really clean. I made sure to leave the seam allowances of the side seams free as I knew I wanted to finish these later, so I did a bit of stopping and restarting to move these out of the way. Again, when I reached the corners, I left the needle in the downwards position, lifted the presser foot and pivoted the fabric around to the new angle. It was then the same routine of removing the tacking. You can see just how far from the edge I ended up stitching the lace as part of easing it in. Sometimes the instructions with vintage sewing patterns leave a lot to be desired, and this was definitely one of those occasions. I creased along the stitching line to press back the seam allowance and then did a second line of top stitching over my first to hold the seam allowance in place. I had to do a bit of faffing at the corners to get everything to lie nice and flat. But once stitched in place, I then trimmed the seam allowance back as close to the stitching as I could. As this lower edge is cut on the bias, it is unlikely to fray, but I did end up going back and fray checking the upper raw edge of the band as this had already started to unravel. The bottom edge of the bodice will eventually be gathered. To prepare the bodice pieces, I run 2 lines of gathering stitches between the balance marks. Next, I construct the skirt pieces by joining the fronts to the backs at the side seams. I press these seams first flat and then open. I then turn the top edge of the skirt over 1.5 centimeters and shape the seam allowance around the curved edge with the iron. I quickly tacked this fold in place before pinning the folded edge of the skirt over the bottom edge of the bodice from the right side. I still matched the raw edges so that the folded skirt edge was positioned exactly 1.5 centimeters up from the bottom edge of the bodice. Then worked from the wrong side to match the balance marks and centre back and centre front. I pinned the front edge in place until I got to my gathering stitches. I then pulled on the threads to start gathering the bodice edge down. I wrapped the thread from one end around a pin to hold them in place, and then gathered from the other end until the bodice was the right length to match the skirt. I then wrap my threads at this end and begin to stroke the gathers with a pin so that they lie evenly. Once happy, I pin the gathers into place and repeat for the other side. With everything pinned, I then tacked the two parts of the slip together with a long running stitch. I clip the excess seam allowance at the centre front to reduce bulk and then machine along the top edge of the skirt to hold everything in place. I use my top stitching foot so that I'm able to get a nice even line. I make sure not to catch the seam allowance of the side seams and smooth my gathers as I sew. It was then that I began to flat fell the side seams. I trimmed down one half of the seam allowance and then folded the wider side over it to encase the raw edge. I then pinned this in place. Once again, using my top stitching foot, I machined the folded edge of the seam allowance in place. Next, I made the straps. To my relief, these weren't made by turning a loop. Instead, both raw edges were folded into the middle of the strap, and then the entire thing was folded in half to encase the raw edges, a bit like bias binding. For this, I experimented with my new pressing bars to try and get a nice even fold. It kind of worked. I then machined along the edge of the straps with my top stitching foot to hold the folds in place. This was really satisfying to do. I then tried the slip on and pinned the straps on at the required length. I secured them in several places, including either side of the insertion lace. This is to stop the weight of the slip stretching out the lace when it's worn. Then I put the slip on my dress form so that I could decide on the hem. I knew that I wanted the slip to be worn under another dress I am making, so I used the skirt pattern from that dress as a guide. I then measured and chalked in how much I needed to cut off and trimmed the hem down. I then folded up the first hem fold and pressed it in place using the steam on my iron to shrink out the excess volume. I then repeated this process for the second hem fold, again using the steam from the iron to get rid of that excess ease. I then set up my machine to do a blind hem stitch and hemmed the skirt by machine. If you've never done a blind hem on a machine before, you basically fold the skirt of the garment back to reveal a tiny bit of the folded hem. You then stitch from the inside of the hem, and the needle occasionally does a little zigzag stitch that just catches the right side of the skirt. I will leave a link to a blog post I wrote about blind hems in the description that does a much better job of explaining it than I can do here. But basically, I love this method of hemming as you can achieve the look and finish of a hand-sewn hem with the speed of a sewing machine. I gave the hem one more final press, stopped for a cup of tea, and the slip was complete. Looking back at this footage of my attempt to model it for you, I think I did alright with this project. I do think it is too big in the bust and maybe a touch too small through the hips, and when I make this pattern again I will definitely work on those areas. But I'm really pleased with the way the insertion lace turned out. And although a bit loose through the chest and back, I don't hate having all that room for movement. All in all, this project was a great way to practice some different skills, and I know that I will get a lot of wear out of this vintage wardrobe staple. Thanks for watching, see you next time.